Ancient voices. Animals may have no words, but they have languages. Calls, howls, even songs. And they have meaning, emotional meaning. At one extreme, there is fear, warning animals of danger. What is the other end of the emotional spectrum? What feelings compel an animal to stay close to the safety and comfort of family?
You have to have emotions to make a decision. The attachment emotion becomes critical. We don't lay our eggs in the sand and swim off. I mean, we've got to have this bonding. So what we're talking about here with emotion is very critical behaviors required for our survival. Without them, we die.
For many years, there has been a scientific assumption that only humans have the capacity for the higher emotions. Loyalty, grief, empathy. But are we unique in our complexity? Or are emotions a universal language? Few people can read the emotional signals of elephants better than husband and wife filmmakers Beverly and Derek Joubert, who have spent nearly 2 decades capturing African wildlife on film. One indelible scene the Jouberts recorded was of an elephant family's remarkable devotion during a moment of physical and emotional crisis.
It was a hard time for the elephants because we were going through a period of drought and they were traveling, they were migrating. The water was drying, it was getting pretty muddy. So often the females would, let their trunks dangle in and they'd be able to drink. And this one little elephant was trying to drink with his tiny little trunk dangling in, and of course he got pushed in accidentally. Once he fell into the water, the mud became almost like quicksand and pulled his little body in. The mother, first of all, trumpeted and sort of whirled around, trying to maybe get attention and in panic. And then she eventually knelt down and she climbed into the mud herself and she put her trunk and her tusks underneath this little elephant and tried to maneuver him.
Somehow they were communicating amongst each other, so that while the mother, who was the matriarch, and the second matriarch were struggling to get the little guy released from the mud, there was somebody else breaking away the bank, creating a ramp for him so that when he did come out, he could just run up this bank. There were buffalo around, others were warding off the buffalo, and so there was this whole community effort going on there.
Eventually, through her calling, a lot of the others in her herd came and assisted her, and they actually eventually popped the little guy out. It was just an amazing time to see the compassion they had and what gentleness they were doing to even get this little guy out, and how when he was out, how they, each one, would then go to him afterwards and just test and smell if he was all right. And of course he was so covered in mud, all that he could think of doing was rolling and getting it all off him.
Katie Payne spends her life listening to the voices of animals. An acoustic biologist, Katie was among the first scientists to hear the songs of whales.
10, 55, 12, 13, 14.
Now she has tuned her ear to the mysterious sounds of elephants, trying to decipher the emotional content of their rumbling conversations.
I think that elephants' communications are full of emotion. Social emotions are probably the glue that holds together the society. They're the individual experiences that cause animals to look out for each other. And without that passion, if you will, or desire to be a social group, the calves wouldn't have the communal care, which is essential to bring them to maturity. Everything that they do seems to come out of a we communal perspective and not very much out of an I individual perspective.
Katie normally does her research in Africa, but on this occasion she visited a captive herd in New Jersey.
We did a little experiment. We broadcast sounds from African elephants and watched the behavior of this group of females and this single male. We got an absolutely fascinating reaction. The question that I had was, why are they so terribly excited? The only answer I can come up with is that they were hearing the voice of an individual they hadn't heard before, and they were feeling turfish. Who is this so close to us, and how did she come to be here?
These elephants had heard no other elephant voices but each other's in over 20 years.
You see how they freeze? Everybody listening together. You often see these freezes when actually there is nothing that the microphone will pick up. I believe that they often freeze in order to listen for others when they haven't heard others. I think it's one of the most interesting signs that they're living outside of their own personal experience, thinking about or imagining others at a distance. It's fantastic when you see 100 elephants doing this. Elephants don't get over emotions quickly. They'll be remembering this.
During moments of high stress or great emotion, elephants secrete a substance called temperin from glands near their eyes. While scientists don't call these expressions tears, most agree that they are an emotional response.
Scientists are amazingly backward about their willingness to ascribe emotions to non-human animals. And in part, I think this is because emotions are hard to prove, but it's immensely important that we get over this block, because when we do figure out how to notice, acknowledge, and measure emotions, then we're going to learn things about animals that people had never believed were possible.
I think we can prove that animals have emotion. I think that there are lots of people now who are starting to learn the techniques that will enable us to answer those questions.
The study of facial expressions is one way of measuring emotion. Chimpanzees have among the most expressive faces in the natural world.
I think you can believe what you see in a chimpanzee facial expression. When they're screaming, I don't think there's any reason not to believe that they're upset about something the same way that we would be upset about something.
Studies have already identified at least 5 universal expressions, easily recognizable in higher primates: fear, disgust, happiness, surprise, and anger.
Right now we're doing a lot of tests that involve face recognition to get enough background about emotion and what the chimpanzees understand about their emotional signals and what they understand about what the context might be if there's been a fight, if they're involved in calming one another down after a fight. When they play, they have very distinctive facial expressions. And this kind of behavioral evidence gives us the first basis to believe that these facial expressions have very distinctive meanings and that they do communicate about different types of emotion. What the chimpanzee understands about their own emotional signals and their own emotional behavior is really, I think, pertinent to understanding a little bit more about the evolution of emotion in humans and why we are the way we are.
The difference between you and a chimpanzee, or you and a dog, or you and a cat is one of degree, not of kind. The reality is that chimpanzees and humans share 98.4% of their DNA. The chimp is genetically closer to a human than they are to a gorilla, and most people don't realize that.
Of the many thousands of genes that contribute to building our brains, as few as 50 separate humans from chimpanzees. Humans, chimpanzees, and all mammals share the ancient reptile brain, which still controls basic emotions of survival, such as fear. Over the next 100 million years, a more emotionally sophisticated layer developed, giving rise to motherhood and a genuine ability for learning. With the evolution of the brain's third layer came a great capacity for complex social emotions, those that govern herds, packs, and human societies. The most modern brains, those belonging to chimpanzees and humans, differ more in size than design. Because a family of chimpanzees has learned American Sign Language, we have a chance to hear them speak their minds and to see their desires. Often, they're not very different from our own.
Sweet, she's signing sweet, and she has a whole thing of desserts in front of her. And she fixed the magazine. Sweet that. Sweet, sweet. Sweet, sweet. That. That. That berry. Sweet, sweet, sweet.
When chimps sign to themselves, you know, they sit there, they look at the magazines, they talk to themselves. It's like you or I or anybody driving along in their car and alone and saying, oh, what a beautiful sunset. It's called private speech, or in this case, private signing. They're talking to themselves. Now, what's interesting about private speech is one of the few times that you really know what someone's thinking, right? Oftentimes, we may be thinking one thing and then we edit, change, and so on. But it's thinking aloud. That. See, it holds. That. And see her hold it. Cheese. And that's a question. She's asking Debbie a question. She's saying cheese, holding the sign and looking up at Debbie. Language has been referred to as the last bastion of human uniqueness. Their ability to acquire language, to speak with us, to use signs, basically they're saying Darwin's right. You can talk, we can talk. You can acquire language, guess what? We can acquire language. To really understand humans, we have to take others on their terms and look not at the differences, but the similarities as well. Too often we forget that we are human beings and that human is simply an adjective that describes the nature of our beingness. The chimpanzees are really chimpanzee beings, and we're, both of us, emotional beings. That's how we form our bonds and our ties.
While we might believe that the toughest animal always rules, primate researchers say that friendship can be even more powerful than aggression in determining which individuals will ultimately succeed. In Sri Lanka, natural history filmmakers witnessed the power of friendship firsthand while documenting a group of rhesus macaques known as the Temple Troop. Hegel had been the troop's leader for over 5 years. Usually, the dominant male manages to lead a troop for only about 3 years, but Hegel was a kind father and a gentle mate. Ducci, a younger male, had his eye on Hegel's job. He'd have to fight him for it. After months of tension and threats, Ducci finally made his move. Jeeves, Hegel's closest friend, rushed to Hegel's side. But Ducci would not be deterred. Ultimately, this was between Ducci and the leader. At battle's end, Hegel was left with severe wounds, which Jeeves gently tended. Hegel's injuries proved fatal. Each member of the Temple Troop paid their tender respects to a fallen friend. Except for Ducci. The unchallenged victor now took over the troop. But Ducci was hardly the beloved leader that Hegel had been. He was rough with his mates, abusive to the babies. Then one day, the filmmakers found Ducci badly beaten and humbled. Researchers watching the Temple Troop believe that a group of females, outraged by Ducci's unfriendly treatment of their children, had sought revenge. Ducci was reduced to low man in the troop, his harsh rule having lasted only 3 months. The new leader? Jeeves. Instead of a bully, the troop had chosen a friend. Primatologist Franz de Waal has been studying exchanges between chimpanzee friends. The soothing touch of grooming is the emotional currency of their world.
Chimpanzees have a high level of reciprocity in their social system, and they have what I call a service economy. And so they exchange favors all the time within their community. And I think this is one aspect of human morality that we very highly value in our own societies. We're very reciprocal beings, and we constantly think in terms of obligations and tit for tat. So I see a parallel. It's not really an economy the way we have, where we exchange money and stuff like that. But it is certainly the beginnings of an economical system and the beginnings of a moral system are present in the chimpanzee.
In what they call a food test, researchers carefully watch the grooming habits of each member of the troop.
Good picture.
Then they offer the chimpanzees their favorite food and track how grooming affects with whom they share.
The food giving in chimpanzees is very unusual. They have food, and they permit some of them to take food from them, and others they don't permit to do that. So it's passive sharing. They are particular about food sharing in the sense that they have certain friends that they do it a lot with and certain friends that do it very little with.
The experiment revealed that there is a reciprocal trading of grooming for food. An even more surprising result of the research is that the chimps are especially generous when groomed by someone who doesn't normally groom them.
It's almost as if you taking notice. Oh, this is a very special moment here. I'm going to redo the favor. It's very hard to explain that sort of exchange without an emotion like gratitude.
If more proof is needed that animals have the capacity for gratitude, Washoe is that proof, despite a life spent enduring the deprivations of captivity.
Washoe and her family lived for 13 years in 4 rooms connected by overhead tunnels and one ground-level tunnel that connected a very small room at the end of the hallway on the 3rd floor of the psychology building.
Washoe's providers had wanted to give her and her family a better home, but it took years to plan, fund, and build. Then, as moving day approached, they wanted to assure the chimps that gaining a new home would not mean losing old friends.
Washoe had moved twice before in her life, and those moves always involved leaving people behind. And so I created a videotape of what the new building looked like and videotaped Roger and Debbie and showed that, and signed to them when I showed it to them and said, look, this is your new home, and showed them some of the different things, had followed Roger through, and they were very interested.
When the Chimpanzee and Human Communication Institute was finally ready, the chimps were moved at night. The next morning, Washoe's family woke in their new home.
They hadn't been out for 13 years. I mean, they hadn't been out in the fresh air and see the sun and feel the grass. And we thought they would just run out and swing and play and so on. And when they were excited, they were hooting and they came rushing out. And Washoe, rather than going out and playing, she came down to a wire area where Debbie and I were standing. And she reached through the wire and she took Debbie's face and then went to play. She was thanking her.
I was teared up. I had tears streaming down my face because it was the true. She was very, very grateful. It was a moment that I think that it will forever be embedded in our brains, in our memory.
There's a friendship, even a kinship between some humans and animals that dissolves the barriers between us. These relationships reveal a world rich with shared emotions.
When I look in a dolphin's eye, I see almost human. There's something about it that the more you look at it, the less dolphin it is, and the more eye it is. And suddenly, you know, a lot of elements go away, and it's like I'm looking into your eye. I feel their there's something being communicated. Something's going back and forth. It isn't one way. Yeah, I'm looking at the dolphin, but the dolphin is looking at me. And chances are excellent that the dolphin, with its sonar and its eyes and its, its capabilities, knows a lot more about me than I know about it.
The most obvious bonds between humans and animals are with pets. 37 million Americans give their cats Christmas gifts. Of 60 million dogs living as pets in the United States, 10 million get to sleep on their humans' beds. 2 million dogs are served a special meal on their birthdays. Living so closely with our pets, we're highly attuned to each other's emotional states, but our bond goes further. New studies reveal that we even share the same emotional disorders. Veterinarian Nicholas Dodman at Tufts University is a pioneer in treating anxiety and depression in animals.
They do respond to human antidepressant medication. The explanation for why dogs and cats respond to human medication must be that the brains are sort of fundamentally similar. You could teach the anatomy of the human brain in gross terms using, for example, a dog brain. So that structurally it looks the same. He looks terrific.
He's doing very well.
I first saw Hogan in 1994. Connie Bombasi had owned him for about 9 months. He'd had a dysfunctional history, he'd been abused, and she provided this wonderful home for him. I would think a large percentage of Hogan's original problems are emotionally based. I mean, he had the double negative effects of this, what I call dysfunctional environment of, abuse and neglect earlier on. Plus, he was deaf, which makes life a lot more confusing to be in this silent, visual world, not understanding things, and to be bounced around like a cork on the ocean. And then he found his rock, which was Connie. He became very bonded to her, couldn't be separated, cleaved to her like a Velcro strip. She went back to work, and his world sort of fell apart.
About a month after I started going back to work, Hogan became compulsive about pacing. And then he combined pawing with the pacing, and he would pace, paw, constantly.
He displayed what behaviorists would call a displacement behavior, which later, he would display this pawing, pacing, even when there was no apparent stress, so that then it had assumed kind of compulsive proportions. He was an upset, unhappy, anxious dog who was morbidly bonded to Connie. We had to use an antidepressant to get him out of the original hole that he was in.
The antidepressants treated Hogan's obsession, but the Dalmatian's deafness kept him isolated.
Calm. Kiss. Thank you. Now, take it gentle. Good, yes, good, handsome.
Connie taught him some American Sign Language so that they could communicate. Hogan now knows over 60 words. Finally, Dr. Dodman felt that Hogan needed to build confidence so that Connie would not be the sole anchor in his life. She and her husband built an elaborate obstacle course. Hogan's spirits seemed to soar with each successful run.
I think a dog needs a life, It's almost like what I call a get a job program, and that is, they need something to do.
There they go. Yeah, there they go.
Some dogs have actual jobs and even an emotional connection to their work. Immediately after the bombing in Oklahoma City, specially trained dogs and their human partners were brought in from all over the country to help find survivors. It soon became clear, however, that the dogs would be spending long days and nights finding only bodies.
I remember stories about the Oklahoma City bombing, when you have these huge places where there are many corpses, and the dogs, of course, will find people in those wreckages at that point, that the dogs get depressed. And that's a very interesting phenomenon. The dogs get depressed to the point that they don't want to go into these areas anymore. So even though they have been trained and they get all the rewards and the praise that they normally get, they don't want to do this work anymore.
When the constant disappointment of finding no survivors took a toll on the dogs, their trainers found that even affection would not lift their spirits.
This is very stressful for the dogs. They understand death, or at least we think they do. They find this just as disturbing as the rest of us. If all you find throughout the course of the day are the deceased of a disaster, at the end of the day, we will make a concerted effort to set up a mock search where the dog is assured of finding a live person. Typically, it's another co-worker, a co-searcher, just so we can finish the day on an upbeat note.
What it indicates is that behind the things that they do and that for which they have been trained, there's also some sort of emotion that we don't completely understand, but it's certainly not just a reward and punishment kind of training. There's some sort of emotion and maybe even joy involved, joy of finding someone alive.
The bonds between humans and canines have been deepening for over 10,000 years, but there are still moments when a dog's capacity for devotion can be profoundly moving.
I guess my first realization about animal emotions didn't come in school. I grew up with it. I mean, I grew up on a farm, and it was primarily a vineyard, but we had our dogs and we had our milk cows and so on, and they were part of the family. Brownie was just an amazing dog. She sort of adopted us and wasn't your usual, in-house dog, but she was out and very watchful of the family. She really did watch us. It was a hot California day, and we were coming in from picking cucumbers. Of course, the road in was well rutted and had real thick dust, and it was throwing up dust, the truck was. My brother, who was just older than me, had borrowed one of my older brother's bicycles, which was very big, and so he started out before we went in, and he was weaving along, and the dust was so thick that you couldn't see. It was like driving through a very thick fog. Brownie, even though we'd done this hundreds and hundreds of times, did something she'd never done. She started barking at the truck. My older brother driving it looked down and thought this was unusual, and finally she, rather than stopping, she actually ran in front of the wheel and he ran over her. The truck stopped, and I was on the truck. I felt, and everybody, the whole family felt, that we just run over this dog. When the truck stopped, not, just 10 feet in front of the truck, was my brother stuck in a rut where his bicycle, he couldn't get it out and was panicked. And had they continued, we certainly would have run into him. We would have run him over rather than her. She made a choice. It was her choice to sacrifice herself. Brownie had, if you will, a parental relationship with all of the children in the family. And we were basically her pups, I'm sure.
Grief is one of the most profound and disturbing emotions in the repertoire of the heart. Do animals experience this suffering as humans do? Even among animals that routinely kill others to survive, can there be feelings of loss? Jim Dutcher's keen eye has most often been trained on the inner workings of wolf societies.
With wolves, we think of packs as sort of a mob, a group of animals roaming in the forest, unrelated to each other. A pack is really a family. It's mother, father, sister, brother, aunts and uncles, grandfather, grandchildren. And more than anything else in their life, they care about each other and they care about their family.
Wolf packs maintain a very strict hierarchy. At the top of the ladder is the alpha male. On the bottom rung, the omega. In this pack, a wolf named Mataki. Utterly submissive, Mataki is the last to eat and the first to be used as a scapegoat to reduce tensions in the pack. From all appearances, she seems a scorned outcast. But a sudden tragedy showed Jim just how cherished even the lowest member of the pack can be.
We saw emotions in the wolves throughout the time that we lived with the wolves, but especially there was an incident where a mountain lion had climbed the fence, got in the enclosure, and killed Mataki. What surprised us is the fact that the pack mourned. They normally play every day. They pull each other's tails, they chase each other. There's always these games that the wolves are playing. And then the wolves stopped. For about 6 weeks after that, they moped around, and when I would walk with them through the area where this all took place, they'd become visibly saddened again. And their tails would be tucked, their ears would be back, and they would lose those expressions of joy that they would have on their face. I think that was grief. I've read about this before. Scientists have been following wolves with radio telemetry. A wolf has been trapped and killed in the area, and the pack will roam in figure-8 patterns, searching and searching and howling in a very sad way.
The bonds of family seem to transcend death, as filmmaker Martin Kolbeck has also witnessed.
I've seen elephant grief on a couple of occasions. One occasion was when the family that we were following came across the bones of a relative. It was Echo's, the matriarch's, best friend. We knew these bones to be her bones, and the reaction was quite extraordinary. The family was emerging from some palms, and then suddenly one of the individuals caught the scent of these bones. She actually visibly reacted, whereupon the rest of the family just moved around these bones and started smelling them and touching them with the tips of their trunks. Some of the younger calves actually picked up ribs and put them in their mouths, and the matriarch, Echo, concentrated on the skull. Unbelievable scene. She went up to it and she started smelling it in the eye sockets, underneath the jaw. It was a very moving scene. The whole family were just smelling and interacting with these pieces of bone. It was incredible. I believe that they actually knew it was a relative of theirs from the smells. And they won't do that to every set of bones they come across. There's no doubt in my mind about how complex and social and certainly emotional elephants are.
What concept animals have about death cannot be known, but judging from their behaviors, there is a keen awareness of loss. Among the macaques living in a national park near Nagano, Japan, winter brought tragedy to a first-time mother named Marulius. Her premature baby was born dead. She carried the lifeless body for days. Normally, a mother will abandon her baby's corpse after it stops resembling an infant, but not Marulius. Day after day, she wandered, holding her baby's body as if it were still alive. Finally, park rangers stole the body and buried it. But this did nothing to alleviate the young mother's suffering. Obsessively, she searched for her baby. Her family could do nothing to relieve her pain. The comfort of living in a social group is that animals can look out for each other, protect each other, care for each other. But how far will one animal go for the sake of another? Until recently, only humans were thought capable of sacrificing food and shelter out of noble feelings like loyalty and compassion. But a colony of primitive mammals called meerkats challenges that notion. Meerkats must cope with the harshest of habitats, Africa's Kalahari Desert. They riddle the desert with burrows so that wherever their constant hunt for food takes the slender creatures, they'll have a safe place to escape danger. On returning from foraging one day, this group discovered a jackal had appropriated one of their burrows for her pups. One bold meerkat decided to investigate. As night fell, she was still on her own, facing the jackal. The following morning, it was clear that the bold one's daring had led to a confrontation with the jackal. Her mother tried to comfort her, but the bold one was weakening by the hour. Her family had to keep moving. They needed food. Meerkats cannot survive on their own in this forbidding environment. So the group slowed down for the bold one, but she barely managed to keep up. When the bold one could go no further, she sat beside one of the other meerkats and waited. Her strength fading, she collapsed at a burrow. One by one, her family returned to her. Hunger waited, safety waited. Still, they did not abandon her. The dying meerkat finally took a few steps away from her family. Within moments, she succumbed. But she did not die alone. What is it that distinguishes humans from all other beings on the earth. Is the human heart unique or one among many? With her capacity for language, Washoe was one of the few animals who can share what's in her heart.
Washoe has expectations of her friends, and if you come in 4 days a week, then by gosh, she expects you in 4 days a week, and if you don't come in, you've got some explaining to do. I was pregnant in the summer of 1982, and I had a miscarriage, and was gone for a couple days. So I came in, and she kind of gave me the cold shoulder, and I said, "I'm sorry I've been gone, but my baby died." And I thought Washoe would understand because I knew she had lost a baby before too. She looked at me, and then she looked away, and she looked back into my eyes, and she signed "cry." And I knew in that moment that she felt empathy. I got up to leave, and she signed, "Please person, hug." And so I came back, and we visited for a while.
There are certain animals in whose lives we can see our own reflections. Animals in whom we see the genesis of our own emotions.
When I look into to the chimp's eyes, like I would a person, I see a person. I see a person with feelings and emotions and caring. We often say that the eyes are the windows to the soul. I see souls in there.
I think ultimately, if we consider that we're made up of physical, mental, emotional, and possibly spiritual, in that we have a soul, the next real question is, if we understand that animals are physical like we are, and they have mental capacities, and they have emotions, do they have a soul?
Wouldn't it be nice if this world were a world where we accepted animals on their terms, where we accepted the fact that, yes, that anger in the dog is anger, and that joy in the puppy is joy. We are a part of this world, and we're not different. We share it. We are not different in kind, but different in degree. We owe a lot to our fellow beings.
In the 1920s, naturalist Henry Beston spent a year living alone, simply observing nature. He found expression for the relationship between humankind and every other creature on the planet. His words echo through time. We need another and wiser concept of animals. In a world older than ours, they moved finished and complete, gifted with extensions of the senses we have lost or never attained, living by voices we shall never hear. They are not our brethren. They are not underlings. They are other nations, caught with ourselves in the net of life and time, fellow prisoners of the splendor and travail of the earth.